The ballroom of the Belvedere Hotel shimmered with soft gold lighting and cautious ambition. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne and foie gras, while industry elites clustered in polite circles, trading forecasts and favors. It was the kind of room Richard Harrington used to dominate effortlessly, a habitat built for predators in silk ties. But tonight, he was a spectator. Across the room, Eleanor stood beside a curated photo display of Atlas Fund recipients. She wore a deep navy dress, simple and timeless, her hair pinned back with understated grace. She looked calm, even as flashbulbs popped in her direction. Someone had recognized her. A former colleague, now a policy advisor to an international NGO, had spotted her on the guest list and leaked the story. Disgraced professor turned billionaire's advisor, a contradiction too irresistible for the press to ignore. Eleanor hadn't flinched. She agreed to one interview and said only this: "I didn't stop being who I was. I just changed the room I set it in." Now, her story was everywhere. Refugee, educator, ethics consultant to a Wall Street tycoon. Tonight's gala had originally been planned as a celebration of Atlas Fund's early success. Now it had become something more, a moment of reckoning for Richard, and for everyone who had once whispered that wealth was best kept silent and unchallenged. He approached the stage slowly when it was his turn to speak. Applause rose politely. He took the microphone with none of his usual swagger. For once, he hadn't prepared a speech. "I've spent most of my adult life building portfolios," he began, voice steady. "Real estate, startups, stocks, debt instruments, you name it. If it had a return, I measured it. If it didn't, I ignored it." He paused, eyes drifting to Eleanor. "But somewhere along the line, I stopped asking what kind of world I was helping to build. I assumed money insulated me from needing to know." The crowd was quiet now. No one sipped their drinks. Then one day, I left the safe open. $50,000 in cash. Not to bait a thief, but to prove what I already believed, that everyone has a price. He let the silence linger. But someone walked past that safe. Someone who reminded me that integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when you're tired and tempted, and no one would blame you for saying yes. Eleanor looked away briefly, her expression unreadable. "I've built a lot of things," Richard continued, "but nothing more valuable than the moment that woman closed the safe and left me a note. 12 words changed my entire definition of wealth." He turned to her. "So tonight, I want to say this publicly. Eleanor Torres is not just a consultant, not just a former professor. She is the single most valuable investment I have ever made. And unlike most assets, her worth doesn't fluctuate with markets." Laughter, soft but sincere. "And so," he concluded, "we are renaming the Atlas Fellowship. Going forward, it will be known as the Eleanor Torres Fellowship for Displaced Scholars." A swell of applause followed. This time it was real. Eleanor stood slowly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no guarded edge between them, just mutual acknowledgement. She gave a quiet nod. That was all. 3 days after the dinner, Richard Harrington did something he had never done before. He walked into his own office building without a single financial document in hand. No prospectus, no performance charts, no deal memos, just an idea. That morning, before leaving the penthouse, he had typed a short message and printed it on premium letterhead. It read, "I'd like to offer you a position, not as a cleaner, as a consultant, ethics, human behavior, and decision-making strategy. Part-time, discreet, compensation negotiable. If interested, join me at 9 a.m. Monday in Conference Room 6B, RH." He left on the kitchen counter, where Eleanor always set the day's cleaning log. No explanation, no pressure. To his surprise and slight anxiety, she showed up. When she entered Conference Room 6B, neutral beige walls, chrome fixtures, nothing sentimental, Eleanor looked entirely unimpressed by the high floors and higher ceilings. "You're serious?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "I wouldn't have invited you if I wasn't. I clean your mirrors, not your conscience." Richard smiled. "That's not what I need." He explained the role. Unorthodox, yes, but intentional. He was tired of yes men. tired of quarterly goals that fed greed more than growth. He wanted a voice at the table who asked better questions, who reminded him of things numbers couldn't measure. "You once said the rarest power is restraint," he added. "I want someone who understands that." Eleanor sat, arms crossed. "I'm not a financial analyst." "No, you're something better. You see systems. And you want to change one?" "I want to build a better one." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded, "On one condition, which is that I'm allowed to disagree with you. Openly." Richard grinned. "That's why I hired you." At first, the arrangement drew suspicion from Richard's executive staff. A former housekeeper, now consulting on ethical frameworks and investment screening? It sounded like a midlife crisis disguised as innovation. But Richard didn't care. He cleared time on his calendar for Eleanor weekly. Their sessions weren't long, but they were dense. She'd arrive with annotated printouts, news clippings, and historical parallels that made his usual strategy meetings feel like kindergarten show and tell. When Richard proposed a high-yield fund tied to rare earth mining, Eleanor asked, "What happens to the water tables of the communities you'll never visit?" When he suggested expanding into AI surveillance systems, she said, "Whose freedom are you monetizing today?" At first, the pushback frustrated him. Then it sharpened him. He began vetting investments through a new lens. Would I be proud to tell Eleanor this is what I built? The effect was contagious. A few analysts, initially skeptical, started to apply her filters to their own models. One even began tracking ethical return on investment across departments. It wasn't just moral. It turned out to be profitable. As trust grew, so did Eleanor's influence. She recommended a shift. Create a venture fund not for high-growth tech, but for refugee entrepreneurs and displaced scholars, people like her with talent buried beneath bureaucracy. Richard approved it with a single sentence. "Let's give capital to people who've already risked everything." They named it the Atlas Fund, not because it carried the world, but because it believed the world had more carriers than anyone noticed. Within the first quarter, the fund backed a Syrian engineer building solar panels from scrap, a Venezuelan journalist launching a multilingual news startup, and a young Afghan coder teaching displaced girls how to program with used laptops. It was the most fulfilling quarter of Richard's life. He barely noticed the profit margins. One evening, as they reviewed applications late into the night, Richard looked up and asked, "Do you ever miss a classroom?" Eleanor considered it. "Sometimes, but I think this is one." He nodded. "You've taught me more than my Ivy League mentors ever did. I didn't come here to teach you." "But you did." She didn't reply, but there was a flicker of warmth in her eyes, a softening that neither money nor fear could produce, only meaning. Richard sat back, the glass walls of the conference room framing the city behind her. He realized something startling. For the first time, he wasn't building an empire to protect himself. He was building something to outlive him. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor paused at the doorway. "You know, I never told you why I closed that safe," she said. "I assumed it was principle. But it was also exhaustion. I've spent years being tempted, by shortcuts, by silence, by survival. That day, I was done bargaining with myself." Richard said nothing, only nodded. Eleanor smiled gently. "And you?" "I think," he said, "I've finally stopped bargaining with my soul." She gave him a look, not approval, but recognition. Then she left. Behind her, Richard stood in a room no longer filled with power, but purpose. Richard Harrington wasn't used to setting his own dinner table. In fact, he wasn't entirely sure where the linen napkins were kept. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and poured amber light into his penthouse, he was moving plates, polishing stemware, and wiping down surfaces his staff usually handled. It wasn't nerves. Not exactly. But it had been a long time since he'd invited someone to dinner, without an agenda. No deal to close. No leverage to gain. No pitch to sell. Just Eleanor. He almost canceled twice. By 7, the table was set. Minimalist. Clean. He wore a blazer over a dark sweater, understated for once. The chef had prepared a 3-course meal and discreetly exited. Richard poured a glass of water for himself, then one for her, before checking the time again. At 7:03, Eleanor knocked. She wasn't dressed up, not in any traditional sense. Slacks, a pressed white shirt, hair down. She looked like someone who valued precision, not ornament, and she carried herself like someone who refused to be impressed just because someone else was rich. "Good evening," she said. "Thank you for coming." He gestured her to sit. The first few minutes passed in silence, filled only by the clink of cutlery and the distant hum of city traffic. Richard noticed the way she ate, efficiently, not rushed, as if trained to never waste anything, even time. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. Eleanor looked up. "For testing you," he continued. It was condescending. "I think I thought I was proving something about you, but I ended up learning something about myself." Her expression remained neutral. "You learned you don't like being wrong." He laughed, startled. "Apparently not." She set her fork down gently. "Why do you test people, Mr. Harrington?" He hesitated. "Because trust has cost me more than betrayal ever did. Then you've trusted the wrong people. Or I've trusted at the wrong times." Eleanor nodded, as if the difference mattered. A pause followed, heavier than silence, not yet uncomfortable. "May I ask what you did before this?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you want a legal version or the true one?" "I'll take the truth. I was a professor. Political theory, mostly. Public ethics, international justice." Richard sat back, eyebrows raised. "And you ended up cleaning houses." "I ended up staying alive," she said, which was the greater challenge. He didn't press. He could see it in her eyes. The names she wouldn't say, the cities she wouldn't mention, the weight of having once mattered, and the quiet pain of being erased. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Not the titles, not the faculty meetings. But yes, I miss shaping how people think. I miss having an intellectual home." Richard exhaled. "I don't think I've ever had one of those." She studied him. "You built your fortune thinking the world is a marketplace. Everything has a value. Everyone has a price." He didn't deny it. "And yet," she continued, "you were shaken when someone refused to play your game." He met her gaze. "You don't have a price?" "I have principles. They're more expensive." He smiled, but there was a flicker of discomfort behind it. "You know, in my circles, we call people like you idealists. That's not a compliment." "I know," she said. "You call truth sentiment and ethics luxury. But I've seen where that thinking leads. To power? To collapse." She took a sip of water, then added, "Eventually, everyone pays." It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict spoken from experience. The main course arrived, brought out on warm ceramic plates. Richard had almost forgotten they were eating. "So tell me," he asked as they resumed, "if money isn't the answer, what is?" "Connection," she replied, without hesitation. "Recognition. The ability to see and be seen without disguise." "That sounds poetic," he said. "It's just human." He thought about that for a while. "I've made billions," he said, "but the room gets quieter every year." Eleanor nodded. "Success isolates. Unless you fight to keep yourself human." "How do you fight?" "By remembering what you still owe the world, and who you were before the money told you otherwise." For the first time in a long while, Richard didn't feel like a man with the upper hand. He felt like a student. And strangely, it wasn't humiliating. It was liberating. They talked for over 2 hours. No contracts. No power plays. Just two people sharing a meal and, cautiously, their truths. As Eleanor stood to leave, Richard didn't offer her a job or a favor or a speech. He simply said, "Thank you. You gave me something tonight that I didn't know I was missing." "And what's that?" "A reason to listen." She smiled just slightly and walked away. Richard remained seated long after the elevator closed, the table half cleared, the city lights blurring beyond the glass. For the first time, he felt richer than his bank account could measure. Richard Harrington hadn't planned on calling Eleanor upstairs so soon. He'd told himself he needed time to process the note, to consider the implications like any prudent investor would. But the truth was simpler. He was rattled. He didn't rattle easily. standing in his study, hands in his pockets. He replayed the safe scene in his head for the 5th time. It wasn't just that she didn't take the money. It was the way she closed the door, deliberately, without performance, as if the thought of theft had never crossed her mind. People were never that clean, not in his world. He had built his fortune on 2 instincts, finding leverage and assuming the worst. People lied, they stole, they negotiated kindness for a favor. That was the rule. Eleanor's refusal to play by it. It wasn't just unexpected. It was disarming. He looked again at the note. The handwriting was neat, angular, disciplined. Each letter spaced with care, as though even her honesty had been measured. He kept rereading the line. I believe some things are not mine to touch, even if they're within reach. It sounded like something his mother might have said, before life had taught her otherwise, before the eviction, before the bankruptcy, before the divorce that left Richard sleeping on a neighbor's floor at age 14. That was the last time he believed in moral absolutes. He'd learned quickly that in the real world, virtue without power was ornamental, and he didn't have the luxury of ornaments. So he climbed, fast, ruthless, calculating. He learned to smile with his mouth and not his eyes. He learned to listen for lies before they were spoken, and he learned that money, unlike people, kept its promises. Until Eleanor walked into his life with nothing but a cleaning rag and principles sharper than his lawyers. Sir, her voice came from the doorway, even and controlled. Richard turned. Eleanor stood poised, not nervous, but alert, the kind of posture that suggested she had been in more serious rooms, under far more dangerous scrutiny. Her eyes met his without hesitation. I wanted to thank you, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. For the note. Please sit. She sat slowly. You're welcome, she replied. They regarded each other in silence. For the first time, Richard noticed the fine lines near her eyes. Not from age, but from experience. She looked like someone who had endured storms and stopped expecting anyone to ask about them. Do you know why I left the safe open? He asked. I assumed it was a test. You weren't offended? No, she said. I've been tested before. Something in her tone made him lean forward. You're not a cleaning lady. She gave a half smile. I'm cleaning your house. That's not what I mean. I know. He opened the file his estate manager had provided. There's nothing in here about your education, your work history before 2015. No social media. No digital footprint at all. Really, I deal with offshore hedge funds more traceable than you. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Then, perhaps I'm a good investment. That made him pause. It was the first time someone had spoken to him in his own language, and yet it didn't feel manipulative. It felt honest. He couldn't tell if that was more threatening or refreshing. I don't trust people, he said plainly. I notice. He smiled in spite of himself. You're not intimidated easily. I've lived through worse than rich men with open safes. That line hung in the air between them. She didn't flinch, didn't embellish, just offered it like a timestamp on her soul. Richard leaned back. For years he had surrounded himself with experts, economists, lawyers, strategists, yet none of them had ever made him question his worldview. Eleanor had done it with a single act and a 12-word note. Where are you from? He asked. Someplace that taught me how to see through power, she said, and how to survive it. He didn't push. For once, curiosity had to yield to respect. Well, he said finally, if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to have dinner tomorrow night. Here, just the 2 of us. She didn't blink. Professional? Not quite. She studied him for a moment. All right. And then, with the same quiet certainty she'd shown in front of the open safe, she stood and left the room. No drama, no gratitude. Just a woman who'd passed a test and, in doing so, exposed the man who created it. Richard stared at the door after it closed. For the first time in years, he wondered if he'd spent his whole life mastering the wrong kind of wealth. The vacuum whirred steadily across the marble tiles as Eleanor Torres moved through the Harrington penthouse, her hands occupied but her mind far away. She had long since learned how to clean on autopilot, how to disappear into her work like a ghost, present, useful, and unnoticed. That was how she preferred it. The moment in the bedroom earlier, when she'd seen the safe ajar, had unsettled her more than she let on. The money inside had glared at her like an open wound, raw, excessive, unnecessary. She hadn't hesitated. But that didn't mean it hadn't cut her. She had seen wealth before. Real wealth, but never quite like this, laid bare, almost daring her. Still, she knew a trap when she saw one. Her father had once told her, back when she was still lecturing in auditoriums filled with restless young minds, that the most dangerous prisons weren't built of steel or stone. They were built of fear, temptation, and silence. When a system wanted to test you, he'd said, always uses bait. She had resisted worse than money. Years ago, Eleanor had been a professor of political theory at the University of Caracas, a rising voice in Latin America's intellectual circles. She was known for her sharp mind and sharper questions. Questions about corruption, injustice, and the fragile myths of democracy. Her lectures have been broadcast, transcribed, and studied abroad. But back home, her fame became dangerous. One night, her office was raided, her passport revoked. She was labeled a destabilizer. Her husband, also an academic, vanished. Eleanor never found out if he had fled, been arrested, or killed. She left the country 2 weeks later under a false name, aided by a former student who owed her a favor. By the time she reached the United States, she was a refugee in everything but title, a woman without papers, credentials, or proof. She applied for asylum, was denied, appealed, and waited. For years, she worked quietly. Kitchens, laundromats, motel night shifts. Teaching was no longer an option. Even cleaning rich men's penthouses came with risks, especially when they were the kind who tested people for sport. But she had learned how to carry her past like an invisible suitcase. Silent, heavy, always close. Back upstairs, Richard Harrington's footsteps tapped across the upper floor. Eleanor kept her head down. She hadn't seen him after leaving the note by the safe. Maybe he'd read it. Maybe he hadn't. It didn't matter. Her job was to clean, not to explain herself. Still, the memory of the safe lingered. She had felt something strange in that room. Not fear, exactly, but scrutiny. It was the same feeling she'd had during interrogations back home, when masked men asked questions they already knew the answers to. There was no point pretending the safe had been left open by accident. It was a probe, a provocation. But she wasn't going to dance for anyone's amusement. Not again. She moved to the grand library, rows of untouched books lined in expensive leather bindings, more decorative than read. One of them caught her eye, a volume on post-colonial resistance. She'd taught from that same edition. Her hand lingered on the spine. Funny, she thought. This world collected knowledge like furniture, valuable only in how it looked, not in how it lived. She wondered if Richard even knew what that book meant. No matter. She returned to her cleaning. What surprised her most wasn't the test itself. It was how tired she felt afterward. Not physically, but morally. Every day in this new country was a negotiation of dignity, of safety, of memory. To have to prove her worth to a stranger who had everything, just to keep her job, stung deeper than she let herself admit. But the note she'd left had been for her as much as for him. I believe some things are not mine to touch, even if they're within reach. She had meant every word. It wasn't pride. It was preservation. If she gave in, even for a second, she'd become the version of herself that the system back home had tried to create. Desperate, corruptible, silent. And she refused to be that woman. A voice called from upstairs, firm, clear. Eleanor, could you come here a moment? Her chest tightened slightly. She didn't answer right away. Not out of fear, but caution. She checked a reflection in the hallway mirror, straightened her shoulders, wiped her hands. Then she climbed the staircase, step by deliberate step, toward whatever came next. Whatever this man wanted, he would get Eleanor Torres. Not the cleaning woman, not the exile, but the person he had underestimated. And that, she thought, might be the most dangerous test of all. Richard Harrington stood in the center of his glass-walled penthouse, surveying the city as if it were a chessboard he alone knew how to conquer. The skyline of Manhattan glittered beneath him, but his attention was elsewhere, fixed on a small, matte black safe recessed into the back of his walk-in closet. It stood ajar. Inside, stacked in precise bundles, was $50,000 in crisp $100 bills. No alarms, no surveillance, just temptation in its purest form. It wasn't forgetfulness that left the safe open. It was a test. Richard, at 45, had long since ceased believing in accidents or people. Trust, to him, was an illusion the desperate clung to. Money, on the other hand, was absolute. It never lied. It revealed. It had taught him that loyalty was often a matter of price. Today's test was aimed squarely at his newest employee, Eleanor Torres. She had been hired just 3 days ago by his estate manager, a short-term cleaning contract for the winter season. Late 40s, perhaps early 50s, with intelligent eyes and a quiet disposition. Her resume was oddly sparse. She spoke with precision, moved without wasting energy, and never once looked him in the eye unless spoken to. Richard didn't trust that kind of discipline. It usually came with secrets. He watched from a discreet corner of the hallway as she entered the master suite, dressed in modest clothes, her dark hair tied back. Eleanor carried a tray of eco-friendly cleaning products like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. She didn't notice the safe at first. Her eyes moved over the room clinically: bed, curtains, rug, window corners. Then, as she approached the closet with a handheld vacuum, she saw it. Her steps slowed. Richard leaned in. She paused at the threshold, the vacuum idle in her hand, and stared at the exposed cache. A long silence settled like dust. Then she stepped forward. Richard's pulse quickened. Over the years, he had performed this test with chauffeurs, assistants, even potential business partners. Some failed, most passed, but no one had ever done it quite like this. Eleanor didn't touch the money. She examined the door, then the hinges. Her fingers brushed the handle, not to open it further, but to gently push it closed. She looked around, fished a pen and paper from her pocket, and wrote something. Then she left. Richard waited until she returned to the lower floor before entering. The room was spotless. On the safe was a folded note, placed neatly in the center, like a signature on a contract. He opened it. "I believe some things are not mine to touch, even if they're within reach." No sermon, no sarcasm. Just a single line with the calm certainty of moral code Richard hadn't encountered in years. He reread the note. Twice, then a third time. Most people would have assumed it was a trap. Hidden cameras. A security guard waiting to jump out. But Eleanor had shown neither fear nor curiosity. She had responded not with suspicion, but with principle. It unnerved him. His instincts told him to discard the note, to file her away under anomaly, and return to familiar rhythms of mistrust. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, something he couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet or reduce to a lesson in behavioral economics. Downstairs, he could hear her vacuum humming faintly, moving from room to room, as if the moment had meant nothing to her. As if resisting $50,000 in plain sight was no more remarkable than wiping down a windowsill. He sat on the edge of his bed, the note still in hand, and realized he had underestimated her. Not just her honesty, but her strength. There was a quiet fortitude to Eleanor Torres that felt out of place in this world of profit margins and legal contracts. A question emerged in his mind, uninvited but persistent. Who was she, really? He stood, folded the note carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. For the first time in a long while, Richard Harrington felt something unusual stir beneath his cultivated cynicism. It wasn't admiration, exactly, and certainly not trust. It was curiosity. Dangerous, inconvenient curiosity. He looked once more toward the hallway, where the sound of cleaning continued, unbroken, as if no test had ever occurred. Tomorrow, he decided, he would speak with Eleanor, not as her employer, but as a man who had just seen a stranger close a door that most people would have torn off its hinges. And somehow, that door's quiet click had echoed louder than any alarm he could have installed.